Given that the previous Labor government drafted and passed this legislation, that we will support what is, in essence, a technical amendment to further extend and to bridge for some 2 years the provisions of this bill to, as the Minister said, ensure that ensure that current claims will be continued to be covered by the legislation. The legislation in its intent, I suppose, can be summed up by the words of the former Minister, who, whilst acknowledging that, and I suspect even the most hardened souls in this Parliament, although I wait in anticipation, would acknowledge that 2 crimes or 2 wrongs do not make a right. I don't think anybody would agree in this House that a prisoner should be assaulted, nor would anybody agree that a prison officer or anybody else should be assaulted or behaviour be inappropriate towards them. That in no way, of course, negates the gravity of what they did to the primary victim, the victim in the community, who may well have been raped or murdered or assaulted or worse. And I want to say, as one person in this Parliament who has to acknowledge, because we're in danger in this Parliament as politicians of sometimes pontificating to people, I have never been a victim of a crime. So it is easy for me to be, as it were, less emotional, possibly more logical, because I have not had a loved one who has been dealt to by an individual. And I always acknowledge that and am mindful of that as we have these debates, because I suspect, had I or a member of my family been dealt to in tragic circumstances, as we have read in the papers over the last year or two, that I would probably be, rather more animated and probably less tolerant in respect of my response to that crime. However, that being said, as I've said before, sir, I don't think anybody would tolerate a wrong being done to a member of the community, and likewise it serves no just purpose to a wrong being done to somebody who is incarcerated. However, it also serves, in my view, no just purpose that a person who has wronged a member of our community gains compensation for a wrong done against them, that is not appropriate, that compensation should be put up for victims, the original victim of the crime, to access. And that was the intent, if you will, of this legislation. I quote from Mark Burton when he said, I think in 2004, he said, "The reason Parliament passed the Prisoners and Victims Claims Act was precisely to recognise that victims have the right to make a claim against any such compensation and to simplify the procedure for doing so." The Minister is correct that there have been some difficulties with that legislation. Its intent, I think, was absolutely clear, and it showed, despite some political comments that I'm sure will be made by others other than the Minister, that the intent of the previous government was to deny those who had done wrong the opportunity to be compensated, but also that compensation was a sanction on those who had offended against that person in incarceration, but equally allow the victim in the community to take advantage and to gain some of the money or resources in respect of that compensation. And the Minister is right in his comments when he says that the easy way to fix this is to stop breaches against prisoners' rights. I must note in passing, though, that the measures put forward by this government in respect of our correctional institutions, where budgets have been cut, where organisations like the Prisoners' Aid and Rehabilitation Agency, a 132-year-old institution in this country that I call a protector of victims' rights. Some would say that's rehab, that doesn't work, we're against it. I say that PARS is actually a protector of our community, because what they do is try and change the behaviour of those who have committed wrongs inside our prisons, so in the hope that they do not offend again and create a further victim, a future victim in our community. They're actually a victim protection organisation, a community protection organisation, yet this government has chosen to cut the resources to them. I also say that it is interesting that the Minister gets up and talks of victims' rights, and I support him in his comments. Despite all the sort of political rhetoric we heard before the election by some minor parties now represented in this House, I would wager that not one member on either side would not say that they are prepared to stand by and support victims. I wager that there's not one member on either side of this parliament that would say that we should have victim support because it is a right for victims to be supported, whether that be to have a shoulder to cry on or whether that be some counselling or support or some monetary resource. But it is interesting, and I note, if you look at ACC, victims of sexual crime, some of the most heinous and disgraceful crimes against innocent members of our community, sir, whether they be children, whether they be young women, young men, elderly folk, which were, of course, eligible in number for ACC compensation and counselling and psychiatric assistance because they have gone through physical torture, they then go through mental torture for the rest of their lives. And yet under this government, sir, as we debate a victims' rights bill and a victim supports bill, sir, this is germane, sir. We have a government now that governs an ACC organisation who has been told to cut the cost, and now we have victims of heinous sexual crime who have mental torture every day of their life, denied basic counselling services, sir. I am told, and I will not be grotesque about this, that a number of these victims have taken their own lives recently. And that is sad, that is a tragedy, and that is a responsibility which will be visited on those who denied them, sir, that assistance. Because I say this bill is appropriate, it is a technical bill, we will support it, but when we come to talk of victims' rights, I really wait for the ACT Party to get up and give us their view on the denial of counselling services to those people who have been victims of sexual abuse, those people who have been victims of sexual assault. But it's interesting, sir, that throughout that debate on the ACC part, where victims are now being denied those basic services as they go through life, not a whimper, not a word of protest from the ACT Party or Mr Garrett, who purports to be the only person, I think he once said, who stood by victims. And I wait with great interest, sir, as we debate this technical bill that has bipartisan support at least. I wait for Mr Garrett and his ilk from the ACT Party to get up and tell us if he supports the government decision to deny those who have been assaulted and worse through sexual crime the basic counselling services, sir, that they need to get through their lives. Because, sir, that is what is happening every day in our community. In every electorate office around this country, I would wager, whether they be Labor or National or Green or ACT electorate offices, sir, we have had women and men come into our offices in tragic circumstances who cannot in any way, sir, now access those services through ACC. And there are those in our community and some commentators who say, well, hang on, that's not an accident. That's not something ACC should cover. Well, I say to them, if they were a victim, who should cover it? I don't care who covers it. I say the state should cover it, and I say the state has a responsibility to be the person who that victim can shoulder, who that victim can cry on, who that victim can get services and counselling, who that victim can be supported by. The state, sir, has a responsibility. So I say that we will support this legislation. We wrote it, we passed it, and I acknowledge, as the Minister has said, it has had some difficulties. But I look forward to some of the sort of learned professionals who claim to be the ones who stand by victims and have the sort of victims' rights at the heart of their political policy and stand by them and have stood by them, so they say, in other places outside this House, to get up and address that issue. Because I know not of an issue that is more important than that. We have men and women in our community, sir, with no support, apart from maybe if they have them, they're far now their loved ones. No professional counselling, that has been denied to them, sir. And if we're really serious about victims' rights, sir, I say that is something fundamentally, along with this legislation, that we must and should address.